Imani looked at the thick manila envelope in his hand, then at the severe, unreadable lines of his face. Her brain was doing that stuttering thing it does when reality breaks, processing information it didn't have a category for yet. Because this man, this Caspian Ryu, a name whispered in the city like a ghost story, was standing in a foyer that cost more than her life, handing her a fortune. Behind her, the elevator doors stood open, a silent witness to the moment her world fractured. In that second, the fear she had carried since entering the black zone twisted into a cold, paralyzing realization. A tip like this wasn't a gift. It was a marking. If this glimpse into Caspian's world has you gripped, then stay tuned because the city is about to find out exactly why he chose her. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more high-stakes stories. She stood on the sidewalk,
Let us know in the comments.
breathing hard.
Would you take the money
watch the street
or run?
A black
Now,
car that had been
let's take
trailing
you back
the bus
to where Imani's
pulled
journey
over
really
smoothly
began.
to the curb. In the
Two men sat
exhaust-choked
inside.
streets where hope
They didn't look like
was
the
just a
street
word
predators
for people
from
who could
yesterday.
afford it.
They were
The Fourth
clean
Street
suits
Diner
and
sat on a
sat
corner of the
perfectly
city
still.
that the sun
They didn't look
seemed to skip
angry
over.
or greedy.
It was a place
It
of
looked like they were
sticky
doing a
counters,
job.
flickering
Imani
neon,
realized the truth.
and help wanted
These were
signs that
Caspian's
never
men.
came down.
They were his
Imani
silent
Cole
shadows.
lived her life
He hadn't
in
just
the
given her a
margins
tip.
of places
He
like
had claimed
this,
her.
doing
She wasn't a
exactly what
free
the city
person
required
anymore.
of her.
She was a
and
piece on a
receiving
game board that
absolute
belonged to the
bare
Mafia
minimum in
Boss.
The city was like a machine
$10,000
that ran on the
just for
sweat
Nana's
of
medicine.
the nobodies.
It was a leash.
And expected
She
them
felt
to
a
be
strange
grateful for the
mix of
privilege
fear
staying
and
hungry.
anger.
Imani
Part of her
had
felt
no
safe,
memory
knowing
of
that the
life
neighborhood
without
thugs
the ache.
wouldn't dare touch
Just a
her
specific
as
shape
long
that
as
these
these
shadows
shadows
were
were
around.
into a
But a
person's
bigger
soul.
part of her
You would
felt
think
like
that
a
in a
bird
neighborhood
cage.
where everyone
Every
was
time she looked in a
drowning,
mirror,
people
or
would
turned
reach
a
out
corner
to pull each other
she
up.
saw the
You would
reflection
think the
of
shared
Caspian's
weight of
power.
poverty would
He was
create
protecting
a
his
bond,
investment, a silent agreement that we are all in this together. It didn't work that way. Not for Imani, because Imani was invisible, just another delivery girl in a faded uniform. And in a city that only respects power, being invisible was its own kind of death sentence. The sun never really seemed to reach 4th Street. It was always blocked by the tall, gray buildings that made everything look old and tired. Imani Cole felt just as tired as the sidewalk she walked on. Her shift had started at 5 in the morning, and the air was still cold and damp. By noon, her feet were throbbing inside her cheap sneakers, but she couldn't stop. In this city, if you stopped moving, you disappeared. Imani worked as a delivery courier. Her uniform was a faded gray and white striped dress that had seen better days. She carried 2 heavy canvas bags that pulled at her shoulders until they felt like lead. Every time she climbed a set of stairs or dodged a car on the street, she reminded herself why she was doing this. She wasn't doing it for herself. She was doing it for Nana. When Imani finally got a 20-minute break, she didn't buy a nice lunch. She sat on a plastic crate behind a diner and ate a cold piece of toast. She pulled a crumpled envelope out of her pocket and counted the bills inside. It wasn't enough. It was never enough. The rent was due in 3 days, and the heat in their small apartment had already been turned off. But the biggest weight on her chest was Nana's medicine. Nana was the only person who truly saw Imani. To the rest of the world, Imani was just a girl in a uniform bringing them their food or their mail. People looked through her like she was made of glass. They didn't see the worry in her eyes or the way her hands shook when she was tired. But at home, Nana would hold her hand and tell her she was special. Now, Nana was the one who needed help. Her heart was getting weaker, and the pills she needed cost more than Imani made in a whole week of triple shifts. Just a few more orders, Imani whispered to herself. She wiped a smudge of dirt off her cheek and stood up. Her legs felt heavy, like she was walking through deep water. The city around her was loud and mean. Drivers honked their horns, and people pushed past her without a word. She felt like a ghost haunting the streets she grew up on. As the sun began to set, the sky turned a bruised purple color. The lights of the rich part of the city began to twinkle in the distance. Up there, people didn't have to choose between eating and buying medicine. Up there, people were visible. Imani looked down at her thin wrists and her dirty bags. She felt so small, like a tiny speck of dust that could be blown away at any moment. She didn't know that tonight everything was going to change. She didn't know that she was about to walk into a hallway that would make her the most visible girl in the entire city. For now, she just gripped her bags tighter and headed toward her next delivery, praying that the tip would be at least $5. The phone in Imani's pocket buzzed with a sharp vibration that made her jump. It was late, and the city felt different at night. The air was colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch out like long fingers. She looked at the screen and saw order number 402. Most drivers would have canceled the order immediately. The delivery address was in the black zone. The black zone was a part of the city where the streetlights didn't work and the police didn't go. It was owned by people who lived by their own rules. High above the broken streets sat the Dragon's Peak, a massive glass building that looked down on everyone. That was where the order was going. Imani's heart hammered against her ribs. She knew she should go home to Nana, but the delivery fee for this trip was 3 times higher than usual. It was the cost of the medicine. She pedaled her old bicycle toward the dark center of the city. The further she went, the quieter it became. There were no more honking cars or shouting people. Instead, there were men in dark suits standing on corners, watching her with cold eyes. Imani kept her head down and her hands tight on the handlebars. She felt like a small mouse running through a den of sleeping lions. When she reached the entrance of the glass tower, 2 large men blocked her path. They didn't say a word. They just looked at her faded uniform and her small bags. One of them scanned her with a metal detector while the other checked her delivery box. After a long minute, they stepped aside and pointed toward the elevator. The elevator didn't have buttons for floors. It only had a sensor. As soon as Imani stepped inside, the doors slid shut with a soft hiss, and she felt her stomach drop as the lift shot upward. She watched the numbers climb higher and higher. 50, 60, 70. When the doors finally opened on the top floor, the air smelled like expensive wood and old money. The hallway was lined with polished marble that felt like ice. Huge mirrors with gold frames hung on the walls, showing Imani a version of herself she didn't recognize. She looked messy and out of place in such a beautiful house. At the end of the hall, a set of heavy wooden doors stood open. Imani walked slowly, her sneakers squeaking on the shiny floor. Every step felt like a mistake. She reached the doorway and stopped. Inside the room, the lights were low, and a man was standing by a window that looked out over the entire glowing city. He didn't turn around at first. He just stood there, tall and silent. Imani felt a chill run down her spine that had nothing to do with the wind outside. She was no longer in the world of diners and cheap rent. She was in the den of the ghost, and for the first time in her life, she was terrified of being seen. Imani sat on the floor of her tiny kitchen, the manila envelope resting on her lap like a hot coal. Her breath came in short, jagged gasps. She had barely made it out of the glass tower before her legs gave way. Now, in the flickering light of a single bulb, she finally opened the flap. The sight of the money made her dizzy. There were hundreds of bills, all crisp and new, stacked neatly in bundles. $10,000. It was more money than she had seen in her entire life. For a few minutes, she felt a rush of pure joy. She could pay the rent for a year. She could buy the medicine Nana needed to breathe properly. She could finally buy a coat that didn't have holes in the pockets. But as the silence of the apartment settled around her, the joy began to sour. The money didn't feel like a gift anymore. It felt like a weight. Caspian Ryu didn't look like a man who gave things away for free. His eyes had been too sharp, his grip on the envelope too firm. In the stories people told about the Mafia, every favor had a price. Imani looked at the front door, half expecting someone to kick it down and demand the money back, or ask for something she couldn't give. Imani? Is it you? Nana's voice drifted from the bedroom, thin and raspy. Imani quickly shoved the envelope under the wooden floorboard beneath the sink. Yes, Nana. I'm just getting some water. She went into the bedroom and saw her grandmother propped up on thin pillows. The room was cold, and Nana was shivering. Imani wanted to run to the sink, grab the money, and shout that they were saved. She wanted to tell her that the struggle was over. But the words got stuck in her throat. If she told Nana where the money came from, it would scare her. If she spent it too fast, the neighbors would notice. Even a grocery store clerk would wonder how a delivery girl suddenly had hundreds of dollars. She realized then that the money was a secret she had to carry alone. It was a blessing that forced her to lie to the only person she loved. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Caspian's severe face and his gold rings. Why her? Why today? She felt like a fish that had snapped up a piece of shiny bait, only to realize there was a sharp hook hidden inside. The money was supposed to bring peace, but all it brought was fear. Imani laid down on her small cot, staring at the ceiling. She listened to the sirens wailing in the distance and the wind rattling the window. She had the power to change her life sitting under her kitchen floor, but she felt more trapped than ever. As she finally drifted into a restless sleep, she wondered if Caspian Ryu was still watching her from his high tower, waiting for the right moment to collect his debt. The news traveled through the city faster than a summer storm. Imani didn't know how it happened, but by the next morning, everyone seemed to know about the girl who got the $10,000 tip. It started with whispers at the diner where she picked up orders. Then, she saw a blurry photo of herself on a local news website. The headline called her the lucky delivery girl. For the first time in her life, Imani wasn't invisible. But being seen was much scarier than being a ghost. When she stepped out of her apartment to go to work, her neighbor, Mr. Henderson, was waiting by the stairs. Usually, he didn't even say hello, but today he had a wide, fake smile on his face. He asked if she could lend him some money for his business idea. Imani hurried past him, her heart beating fast. At the delivery center, the other drivers treated her like she had won the lottery. People she hadn't spoken to in years were suddenly her best friends. They patted her on the back and asked where she was hiding the cash. But behind their smiles, Imani saw a strange look in their eyes. It was the same look she had seen in the mirrors at the penthouse, a look of deep, burning hunger. They didn't see Imani, they just saw the money. By noon, the attention turned from friendly to frightening. A black car with tinted windows followed her for 3 blocks while she was on her bike. When she stopped at a red light, 2 men she didn't know approached her. They didn't look like delivery drivers. They looked like the kind of people who stayed in the shadows of the black zone. They asked her very nicely if she wanted to invest her new fortune in their protection services. Their voices were low and mean, and Imani felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She realized that the tip had painted a target on her back. To the poor people on her street, she was a bank. To the predators of the city, she was a prize. The city was no longer just a place of hard work and tired feet. It was a hunting ground, and she was the prey. Worst of all was the feeling that she was being watched by someone she couldn't see. Every time she looked up at the high glass towers, she felt Caspian Ryu's gaze. He had given her enough money to save her life, but he had also taken away her safety. She was a local celebrity now, but all she wanted was to go back to being the girl that nobody noticed. As she pedaled home in the dark, clutching her bags tight, Imani knew that the friends and the predators were only the beginning. The city was speaking her name, and she was terrified of who might answer. Imani didn't go back to the diner the next day. She kept her head down and tried to stay in the crowded parts of the city. She thought that if she stayed around enough people, she would be safe. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. In fact, it grew stronger. It wasn't the loud, scary attention from the neighborhood thugs anymore. This was something different. It was quiet. It was steady. At first, she thought it was just her mind playing tricks on her. She saw a silver SUV at the end of her block when she left for her morning shift. 2 hours later, when she was delivering a package 5 miles away, she saw the same silver SUV parked across the street. It had dark windows that looked like mirrors. No one got out, and the engine didn't even seem to be running. It just sat there like a silent dog guarding a gate. When she ducked into a narrow alley to take a shortcut, she heard the soft crunch of tires on gravel. She spun around, her heart jumping in her throat, but the alley was empty. Still, she could feel eyes on the back of her neck. It made the hair on her arms stand up. She wasn't being hunted by people who wanted to rob her. These people were too professional for that. They didn't want her money. They wanted to know everywhere she went. By the afternoon, Imani decided to test her theory. She hopped on a city bus, waited until the very last second, and jumped off just as the doors were closing. She stood on the sidewalk, breathing hard, and watched the street. A black car that had been trailing the bus pulled over smoothly to the curb. 2 men sat inside. They didn't look like the street predators from yesterday. They wore clean suits and sat perfectly still. They didn't look angry or greedy. They looked like they were doing a job. Imani realized the truth. These were Caspian's men. They were his silent shadows. He hadn't just given her a tip. He had claimed her. She wasn't a free person anymore. She was a piece on a game board that belonged to the Mafia Boss. The $10,000 wasn't just for Nana's medicine. It was a leash. She felt a strange mix of fear and anger. Part of her felt safe, knowing that the neighborhood thugs wouldn't dare touch her as long as these shadows were around. But a bigger part of her felt like a bird in a cage. Every time she looked in a mirror or turned a corner, she saw the reflection of Caspian's power. He was protecting his investment. As she finally walked up the stairs to her apartment, she saw the silver SUV park at the end of the street again. They weren't hiding anymore. They wanted her to know they were there. Imani closed her door and locked all 3 bolts, but for the first time, the locks felt useless. How could she lock out a man who already owned the street she lived on? The morning started with a sound that Imani had never heard in her building before. Usually, the hallways were filled with the noise of shouting neighbors, crying babies, and the smell of old cooking. But today, the building was eerily quiet. When Imani stepped out to get the mail, she saw men in dark blue jumpsuits walking through the halls. They weren't from the city. They were carrying clipboards and tools, and they moved with a purpose that scared her. Downstairs, a crowd had gathered in front of the main entrance. People were crying and holding trash bags filled with their clothes. Mr. Henderson was there, looking pale and defeated. He pointed a trembling finger at a large white sign taped to the front door. It said the building had been sold to a private company and that everyone had 1 hour to leave. Everyone, that is, except for the person in apartment 4B. Imani's heart stopped. Apartment 4B was her home. She ran back upstairs to find a man in a sharp suit standing outside her door. He wasn't one of the shadows from the silver SUV. He looked like a lawyer. He handed her a folder filled with official-looking papers. As Imani scanned the words, she felt like the floor was falling out from under her. Caspian Ryu hadn't just given her a tip. He had bought the entire building. Even more shocking, he had bought her debt. Every dollar she owed the hospital for Nana, every late payment for the rent, and every cent she owed the electric company. It was all paid. You don't owe anyone anything anymore, the man said in a flat voice. Except for Mr. Ryu. By noon, the building was empty of everyone Imani knew. The neighbors who had been her friends yesterday were gone, replaced by workers who began installing heavy metal shutters on the windows and new, thick doors with electronic locks. They weren't fixing the building to make it nice. They were turning it into a fortress. Imani stood in her small living room, watching them work. She felt a cold knot of fear in her stomach. Caspian had evicted her entire world and left her alone in a gilded cage. He had stripped away the predators and the greedy neighbors, but he had also taken away her freedom. She was no longer a struggling girl in a big city. She was a prize kept in a vault. Nana sat in her chair, looking confused but breathing easier thanks to the new air filter the workers had installed. "Who are these people, Imani?" she asked softly. Imani looked out the window. The silver SUV was still parked at the end of the street, but now there were 2 more just like it. The message was clear. The city couldn't touch her now, but she couldn't leave either. Caspian Ryu had made his next move, and it was the most terrifying thing he could have done. He hadn't just changed her life. He had taken ownership of it. She was safe, she was debt-free, and for the first time in her life, she was completely and utterly trapped. 2 days after the building became a fortress, a knock sounded on Imani's new, heavy door. It wasn't the rough pounding of a debt collector. It was 3 soft, steady taps. When Imani opened it, one of the men in a sharp suit stood there. He didn't say a word. He just held out a small white card. On it was an address and a time. Underneath, in elegant black ink, was a single name, Caspian. A black car was waiting at the curb. As Imani climbed into the back seat, she felt like she was being swallowed by a shadow. The car moved silently through the city, passing the streets she used to bike on. Everything looked different from behind the tinted glass. She felt like a stranger in her own town. Soon, they pulled up to a restaurant that had no sign on the door. The windows were covered in heavy velvet curtains. Inside, the room was filled with the soft sound of the piano. Caspian Ryu sat at a long table in the very back. He looked just as he had in the penthouse, sharp, still and dangerous. But this time, there was a plate of food waiting for her. He gestured for her to sit. For a long time, the only sound was the clinking of silver against plates. Caspian didn't look at her until he finished his glass of water. "You are wondering why," he said. His voice was deep and low, like the sound of a distant storm. It was the first time Imani had heard him speak, and it made her skin prickle. "I don't belong in your world," Imani whispered. She looked at her hands, which were still stained with the work of a delivery girl. "Why did you buy my building? Why did you pay my debts?" Caspian leaned forward. The gold rings on his fingers sparkled under the dim lights. "I do not give gifts, Imani. I settle accounts." He reached into his pocket and pulled out an old, yellowed photograph. He slid it across the table. In the picture, a young man was standing in front of a much younger Caspian. Imani gasped. The man was her father. He had died when she was just a little girl, leaving her with nothing but memories. "Your father was a driver for my family," Caspian explained. 20 years ago, there was a night that should have ended my life. An ambush. Your father didn't run. He stayed. He took the bullets that were meant for me." Caspian's eyes turned hard, like stones. "I survived because he died. In my world, a life for a life is the only debt that matters. I have been looking for his family for a long time." Imani felt the room spinning. All the pain, the hunger, and the years of being invisible were because her father had been a hero to a monster. The $10,000 wasn't a tip, and the building wasn't a cage. It was a payment for a blood debt that was older than she was. "I'm not my father," Imani said, her voice shaking. "No," Caspian replied, his gaze locking onto hers. "But you are the only thing left of him. And in this city, that makes you mine to protect." He stood up, the dinner over. Imani realized that the debt was settled for Caspian, but for her, a new and more dangerous life was just beginning. The safety Imani felt after the dinner with Caspian did not last long. In the city, news about the Mafia Boss's blood debt traveled just as fast as the news of the tip. To Caspian's enemies, Imani was no longer just a delivery girl or a lucky stranger. She was a target. They saw her as the only soft spot in Caspian's hard armor. It happened on a rainy Tuesday while Imani was trying to run a simple errand for Nana. She thought she was safe because she was only 2 blocks away from her fortress-like building. She didn't see the dark van with the sliding doors until it was too late. It screeched around the corner, splashing muddy water all over her faded uniform. Before the doors could open, a silver sedan, one of Caspian's shadows, roared into view. The driver didn't slow down. He slammed into the side of the van, the sound of crunching metal echoing like a gunshot through the narrow street. One of the men from the silver car jumped out and grabbed Imani's arm. "Get in, now," he barked. Imani scrambled into the back seat, just as 2 more cars appeared from a side alley. These weren't Caspian's cars. They were covered in spray, paint, and dents, driven by men who worked for the rival gangs. They wanted to snatch Imani to use her as a bargaining chip against the ghost. The chase began instantly. Imani's driver pushed the gas pedal to the floor, and her head snapped back against the seat. They flew through red lights and darted between slow-moving buses. Imani gripped the door handle so hard her knuckles turned white. Outside the window, the city was a blur of gray rain and bright neon signs. She could hear the screeching of tires behind them as the rival cars tried to box them in. "They won't stop," Imani cried out, watching a black truck try to ram their back bumper. The driver didn't answer. He was focused on the road, his hands moving quickly on the steering wheel. He swerved onto a sidewalk, sending trash cans flying, and then dived down a steep ramp into a parking garage. The tires screamed as they spiraled down floor after floor. It felt like a roller coaster that was about to break. They burst out of the garage and onto a bridge that led toward the black zone. The rival cars were still there, like hungry wolves. But then Imani saw something that made her breath catch. Standing at the end of the bridge were 4 more silver cars, parked in a perfect line. Men in suits stood beside them, holding their ground. When the rival gangs saw the reinforcements, they slammed on their brakes, their tires smoking as they turned around and fled back into the shadows. Imani's car slowed down and finally stopped in the middle of the bridge. The silence that followed was heavy and thick. She looked at her trembling hands. Caspian's protection had saved her life, but the price was clear. The city was at war, and she was the prize in the middle of the battlefield. She wasn't just a girl anymore. She was a reason for men to die. The rain had stopped, but the air still felt heavy and damp. Imani stood in the center of the bridge, watching the silver cars circle around her like a shield. For the first time, she didn't feel like a mouse hiding from lions. She felt a strange, cold heat rising in her chest. She was tired of being the girl who was followed, the girl who was protected, and the girl who was a prize. If her father had died to save a king, she wasn't going to spend her life waiting to be captured. Caspian stepped out of the lead car. His face was as still as stone, but his eyes moved over her to make sure she wasn't hurt. He held out a small, sealed black envelope. "This needs to go to the docks," he said quietly. "To the leader of the men who chased you. It is a choice. They can accept my terms, or the city will burn by morning." He looked at his elite drivers, then back at Imani. "I will send my best men to deliver it." "No," Imani said. Her voice was steady, surprising even herself. "I'll do it." Caspian's brow furrowed. "It is too dangerous. They want you, Imani. They want the girl who hides," she replied, stepping toward him. "They don't know the girl who grew up on these streets. I know the shortcuts. I know how to move through the shadows of the docks better than any man in a suit. If your men go, it looks like a declaration of war. If I go, it's a delivery." She reached out and took the envelope from his hand. Her fingers brushed against his gold rings, and for a second, the power imbalance shifted. She wasn't asking for permission. She was taking her place. Imani didn't take a car. She took her old, beat-up bicycle from the back of the sedan. She pedaled into the darkness of the industrial district, where the smell of salt and rust was thick. She moved silently, ducking behind shipping containers and sliding under warehouse fences. She saw the rival gang members standing by their trucks, looking for silver cars and men in suits. They never even looked at the girl on the bike wearing a faded delivery uniform. She reached the main office at the docks and slid the envelope under the door. She didn't stay to hear them open it. She didn't stay to see their reaction. She did her job, but as she pedaled away, she didn't feel like the invisible girl anymore. She had held the fate of the city in her hands, and she had delivered it on her own terms. When she emerged from the docks, Caspian was waiting at the edge of the light. He didn't ask if she was okay. He simply looked at her and saw a different person. The fear in her wide eyes was gone, replaced by a sharp, severe look that matched his own. She wasn't just surviving the storm anymore. She was part of the thunder. Imani realized that by delivering that message, she had ended her life as a victim. She had walked into the fire, and she had come out as someone the city would finally have to respect. The morning light broke over the city, but it didn't look gray or tired anymore. Standing on the balcony of the glass tower, Imani looked out at the streets below. For years, those streets had been a maze where she struggled just to breathe. Now, they looked like a map that she finally understood. She wasn't wearing her faded gray uniform anymore. Instead, she wore a simple, dark suit that fit her perfectly. It wasn't a costume. It was armor. Beside her, Caspian Ryu stood in silence. He wasn't leaning over her or trying to intimidate her anymore. They stood side by side, watching the city wake up. The news had already spread. The rival gangs had backed down after reading the message Imani delivered. They realized that attacking Imani wasn't just attacking a girl. It was attacking a partner of the ghost. Peace had returned, but it was a new kind of peace. It was a peace built on the strength of a girl the city had tried to ignore. "The building is finished," Caspian said, his voice low but respectful. "Your neighbors are moving back in today, but they aren't paying rent to me. They are paying it to a foundation in your father's name." Imani felt a lump in her throat, but she didn't cry. Tears were for the girl she used to be. "And the medicine for the clinic downstairs?" she asked. "It arrived an hour ago," Caspian replied. He looked at her, and for the first time, a small, proud smile touched his lips. "You were right, Imani. Money can buy a building, but it takes someone who has lived in the shadows to know how to bring the light." Below them, a delivery bike sped past a corner. Imani watched it and remembered the ache in her feet and the weight of the canvas bags. She knew there were thousands of other invisible people down there, working triple shifts and praying for a miracle. She turned to Caspian, her gaze sharp and steady. She wasn't just a girl who had been saved. She was the one who was going to make sure the city started looking at the people it usually walked past. As they walked back inside the penthouse together, the guards bowed their heads. They didn't just bow for the Mafia Boss. They bowed for the woman walking beside him. The city was speechless. They had expected a war, or perhaps a tragedy. Instead, they got a partnership that no one saw coming. Imani Cole had started the week as a nobody with an empty pocket, and she was ending it as a force that even the ghost respected. The invisible girl was gone. In her place stood a queen of the streets, ready to write a new story for the city that had finally learned her name.